There is a version of you that you have spent your entire life pretending doesn't exist, not because you forgot about it, not because you're unaware, but because that version of you carries something you decided, long before you had the vocabulary for it, was unacceptable. And here is the uncomfortable reality. That decision is the single most powerful force shaping everything you experience right now. Your relationships, your ceiling at work, the anxiety that shows up when things get too good, the self-sabotage that arrives precisely when you're on the verge of something real. Carl Jung called this figure the shadow. But the shadow is not simply your dark side. That's the surface-level summary, and it keeps most people stuck. The shadow is the repository of every archetype you've rejected. It's not just your rage or your greed. It could be your ambition, your sensuality, your desire for power, your need for solitude, your capacity for cruelty, yes, but also, just as often, your capacity for radical softness, for dependence, for being wrong. Whatever your particular developmental wound needed you to bury, that's what's living in the shadow. And it doesn't sit there passively, it runs. This is where most people fail to understand Jungian psychology at the level that actually changes them. They hear shadow work, and they think it means confronting the worst parts of themselves. But the archetype you are most desperately avoiding is not necessarily the darkest one. It's the one that, if integrated, would fundamentally destabilize the identity you've constructed. That's why the psyche guards it so fiercely. The ego doesn't just protect you from pain. It protects its own architecture. Here's how the mechanism works. The psyche operates through compensatory dynamics. When you suppress an archetypal energy, say the warrior, the sovereign, the lover, the trickster, it doesn't dissolve. It inverts. A suppressed warrior doesn't disappear. It becomes passive aggression, victimhood, the inability to assert any boundary without it feeling like violence. A suppressed sovereign becomes either total submission or micromanaging tyranny. The energy still moves. You just lose the steering wheel. What makes this particularly difficult to see is the sophistication of the ego's defense system. You don't experience yourself as running from an archetype. You experience yourself as being a certain kind of person, someone who isn't aggressive, someone who doesn't need recognition, someone who is beyond ego, beyond desire, beyond ambition. The spiritual bypass is one of the most common disguises the avoided archetype wears. People spend years in meditation retreats, in self-help cycles, in therapy, genuinely working, genuinely sincere, and still circling the same wound. Not because the work isn't real. Because they're working on the symptom and protecting the source. You think you're growing. But you're actually feeding your shadow. The unconscious doesn't need you to stay broken. It just needs you to stay unaware. Because as long as you're unaware, the avoided archetype continues to author your choices, your projections, your triggers, your ceiling, while you believe you're making conscious decisions. Every time you feel an inexplicable and disproportionate reaction to someone else's confidence, someone else's sexuality, someone else's anger, someone else's success, that charge, that heat, is the signal. That's your shadow pointing at itself. Jung was precise about this. What irritates you in others is almost always what you've refused in yourself. The real question is not whether you have a suppressed archetype. You do. Everyone does. The question is which one, and how violently the system is protecting it. Let's get specific, because abstraction is how this stays theoretical, and theoretical keeps you safe. In 2026, the most commonly suppressed archetypes follow a predictable pattern shaped by the culture you're living inside. You live in a system that rewards performance, productivity, and curated self-presentation at an unprecedented scale. Social media didn't create the shadow, but it gave the ego the most sophisticated mask in human history. And the archetypes being suppressed most aggressively right now are the ones that refuse to perform. The sovereign, the part of you that claims authority, sets terms, and stops apologizing for taking up space, is being buried under a cultural obsession with likability. You've mistaken smallness for humility. The lover, not romantic love, but the archetype of full sensory presence, desire, and absorption in life, is being crushed under relentless optimization. You've mistaken numbness for discipline. The trickster, the disruptive, irreverent, chaos-tolerant part of the psyche, is being strangled by the need for consistency, brand, and reputation management. You've mistaken rigidity for integrity, and the consequence is not subtle. It shows up in your body as chronic low-grade tension. It shows up in your career as the invisible ceiling you keep hitting, not because you lack skill, but because some part of you associates full visibility with danger. It shows up in your relationships as the pattern you keep repeating, choosing unavailable people, sabotaging intimacy at the threshold, cycling through the same argument with different faces. None of this is random. The unconscious is extraordinarily precise. Every pattern is a message from the avoided archetype trying to be seen. Here is the uncomfortable truth most shadow work content will not tell you. Integration is not pleasant. It doesn't feel like healing at first. It feels like a threat. When you begin to reclaim a suppressed archetype, the ego experiences it as regression, as dangerous, as morally wrong. If you've suppressed your anger for 30 years, accessing it won't feel like liberation immediately. It will feel like losing control. If you've buried your ambition under decades of self-effacement, owning it will feel like arrogance. The psyche has been running a story about why that archetype is unacceptable. That story doesn't surrender quietly. This is the mind shift that changes everything. The goal of shadow work is not to become a better behaved version of your current self. It is to expand the total range of what you can consciously inhabit. Integration means the warrior and the peacemaker can coexist, the sovereign and the servant, the lover and the ascetic. You stop being driven by a single, unexamined archetype because you've made room for the full spectrum. And paradoxically, that is when your behavior becomes more ethical, more grounded, more genuinely in your control, not less. The suppressed archetype doesn't make you dangerous when integrated. It was already making you dangerous when it was unconscious. So here is how you begin, concretely. First, locate the charge. Find the person, the quality, the behavior that produces a disproportionate reaction in you. Envy, contempt, fascination, disgust. That charge is the compass. Name what they have that you haven't allowed yourself. Second, track the inverse in your own life. Where are you acting out the shadow of that archetype? Not through expression, but through its distorted form. The person who despises arrogance, but is chronically passive-aggressive. The person repulsed by neediness, who has never once asked for help. Third, create a deliberate container for small expression. Not a dramatic overhaul, a small, conscious act that lets the suppressed archetype exist without the ego collapsing. One boundary stated directly. One desire named without apology. One moment of choosing presence over performance. The archetype you are avoiding is not your enemy. It is the most undeveloped, most energized, most transformative part of your psyche. It has been waiting, not with resentment, but with the patience of everything that knows it cannot actually be destroyed. Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Stop calling it fate. Start calling it what it is.